When you're in orbit around the Earth, what you see is beauty, and you see wholeness, and you see connectedness. It's not that you as an astronaut don't realize there is chaos below, but this is the whole point of the overview effect in a way, is the diversity of life on Earth, both good and bad diversity. It's part of a whole. So when an astronaut comes back to the surface, they begin to adapt to the chaos. But what they bring back is a deep understanding that, yes, that's the content I see, but the context of it is really wonderful and beautiful and optimistic.
Hello and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll hear from people around the world who are making our future amazing, and we're just not hearing enough about it in the negative noise on the news cycle or social media or what have you. Today with the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, I've got an amazing guest that I got goosebumps about when I got the email back that I was going to be able to interview this man. Frank White is an author, a space philosopher, and a consultant. He is the person who coined the phrase overview effect. And the overview effect is this amazing concept about the transformative way astronauts feel once they see the Earth from space. Apparently, it touches something in us that is so expansive that it's almost undescribable. Frank coined this term a good 30 or 40 years ago. The story is quite extraordinary, and he has been working and been a respected authority in various aspects of the space industry ever since. He's best known for that phrase, but he's also authored a whole bunch of books about space exploration, climate change, artificial intelligence. Frank White is one of those people that is in the background of our lives, and we will never know or appreciate what he has contributed to our understanding of how we fit in the universe. So here we are. Welcome, Frank White.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, I have to tell you that that we have a mutual friend who serendipitously we were introduced to each other by, and timing is everything. And I can't tell you how important I feel like it is these days for us to be talking about space and the why and the what happens next. And then I interviewed a great Nicole Stott, an astronaut, about 3 or 4 months ago, and I will refer people in the show notes about that interview, but she talked about you through that whole interview. It's just lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. And my thanks to Nicole, who has been a really wonderful supporter of this work. And she's in that film Overview.
Yes.
And she is doing great work with art and children. And she is the space artist.
What could be better? She, in one of our interviews, actually, I'm going to be end up doing 3. She talks about what it was like to take watercolors in space, and that moment where you dip your brush in and you have to take that drop over to the. I don't know. There's so many people like you all who the everyday person doesn't know about, and that's our mission here, is to share your vision of what's possible, because that's the whole thing. I meet people like you, and you see possibility all around you, and what we'd love to hear more about today is what you think is possible and the potential that's in the future. So thank you for joining us. Let's start with the first question. One thing I found in the book where you're saying we have a choice of going deeper into the chaos or looking up.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's about as fundamental as it gets. Talk to us about going deeper in the chaos versus looking up.
Yeah. Well, looking up can be a very physical term, looking up into the sky and seeing what's out there from the surface. And looking up can also be an attitude, really. I think that what I am attempting to convey is an attitude, and it means both leaving the planet and having a unique vantage point to look back at our planet. And when you're in orbit around the Earth, what you see is beauty, and you see wholeness and you see connectedness. And it's not that you as an astronaut don't realize there is chaos below, but this is the whole point of the overview effect in a way, is the diversity of human life, the diversity of life on Earth, both good and bad diversity. And then you realize, yes, but it's part of a whole. So you see that it is both things, and neither perspective is wrong. So when an astronaut comes back to the surface, they begin to adapt to the chaos, the ever changing reality of life on the surface. But what they bring back is a deep understanding that, yes, that's the content I see, but the context of it is really wonderful and beautiful and optimistic. As I said, we can push further into the chaos of human life, or we can realize there's much more to it than that, really.
That is so true. It's content versus context, because that's what we're absorbing, and that's what's flying at us all day long is content,
Yeah,
content, content.
yeah,
Yeah, but what other, like we got to pause and really consciously try and discern the context.
yeah. And one thing that I do like to say about the overview effect is it has three elements. There are three parts to it in terms of the astronaut experience, and one is love. The experience of seeing the Earth in that way, many astronauts report it made them cry. And we don't think astronauts cry. We don't think they're like that. But I've had more than one tell me, I cried when I first saw the Earth. I can't tell you why exactly, and they can't either, but there's something emotional. I guess it's like seeing your mother for the first time, because Earth is our mother, really. And the other aspect is truth. From the surface of the Earth, we do not see the truth. We experience being on this stable platform and the heavens revolving above us. We don't see that we're actually on a spaceship, and it's called Earth. And it is moving very rapidly around the sun, of course, but the sun is moving around the galactic center, and we really are in space. We don't really go into space, we're really there. We simply leave the spaceship and look back. And then the final element is identity change. Most of the astronauts, and I'm speaking of astronauts who are there for a while, they first they go to the cupola on the International Space Station and they look for, let's say, Boston. Oh, there's Cape Cod, which is probably what I will do if I get there. But then you go around, and you continue this orbit, and then you start looking for the United States. Oh, there's the United States. And then eventually you lose all that, and your identity is with planet Earth, not with a place. Again, it's the whole versus the parts. So truth, identity, and love are the key features of this change that happens that people have. And they may not use that term. I'm extrapolating it from my interviews.
This choice of chaos or looking up. Tell us about this story. You told me in our pre-interview this great story about Bobby Kennedy and MLK's assassination, the Vietnam War, like all that was happening, and
Yeah.
then we went to the moon right in the middle of it all. Talk to us about that.
Well, it was a big year in my life. I was at Oxford at the time doing graduate work, and I got completely derailed in my path by the war in Vietnam. So many young men of my age had to choose right then and there. What are you going to do? If you love America, but you believe the war is the wrong thing to do, what do you do? And it was difficult for me. So one option was to go to Canada and be a quote unquote draft dodger or deserter, not very palatable. The other option was to stay home in America and become a conscientious objector or a resistor and go to prison and so on. The other choice was go to Vietnam. So I was going through that, and I was also a co-founder of an organization in Oxford, mostly American, and we were opposing the war, but we were attempting to tell people this is part of a larger system. The war didn't happen overnight, and it's not even our war. It's really what we're opposing mostly is American involvement in a war. But any event, so much happened. Suddenly, Eugene McCarthy challenged Lyndon Johnson to the presidency or the nomination, and he did so well in New Hampshire that Lyndon decided not to run again. Does that sound familiar? Don't run for a second term. And he stopped bombing North Vietnam, and he tried to start peace negotiations. At the same time, there was something called the Tet Offensive. Everybody had been told that the United States was winning the war. And then the offensive happened, and there were what we call Viet Cong or National Liberation Front soldiers running through the American embassy shooting at people. And this uprising was really jarring for people in the United States. So we're kind of dealing with all that. And then not long after all of that, Martin Luther King was killed. He was assassinated. And he was a very important person to African Americans, but also to everyone who believed in social justice. It was terrible. And, we had somewhat survived the assassination of President Kennedy, but we weren't far from that. And it was all about change, really. And there were uprisings, if you want to call it that, riots in the cities. Cities were on fire. And then Bobby Kennedy was killed.
I mean, this is all, I think people have forgotten about this chapter of history. We think our times are so dark, Frank. But this
dark.
is like 1962 to 1968, like 3 major assassinations. How about Kent State? National Guards were shooting college students the age of my kids. What the heck?
But that was later, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, it did happen. You're right. But it was in 1970. But 68 was such a turning point, and I was really, really down. I really wondered, can we really make change, meaningful change? Because we had had some success with Johnson choosing not to run, but then there were all these other problems. And I was in London in December of 68 visiting friends, and the Apollo 8 mission happened. And that was not supposed to be a lunar mission. It was supposed to be an orbital mission. And NASA boldly said, let's go to the moon, because they thought the Soviet Union was about to go to the moon. And even though the astronauts didn't land, it was a turning point for many, many people. Because 2 things for me. On the way to the moon, they just kind of casually turned the camera around and said, I want to show you the Earth. And I was not prepared for that. It wasn't really a great picture, but it was stunning because I'd never seen the whole Earth before. And then famously,
and so had basically no one else had either, right?
There were a few kind of grainy pictures that had been taken, but not in real time. Yeah. And it hadn't really penetrated very much. And then the 3 astronauts actually weren't sent to the moon to look at the Earth, famously. They were looking at the moon. And there's just a very famous clip that NASA produced where they're looking at the moon and they're trying to be geologists, which, of course, that wasn't their training. But one of them is saying, I saw a crater I couldn't tell whether it was had anything to do with volcanoes, and then all of a sudden he said, "Oh gosh, look at that! That's pretty. That's really pretty." And the Earth was rising above the moon, which is Earthrise, the famous Earthrise. But it was almost accidental, and it's almost comical because it's Bill Anders who's saying this, and he's saying, "Get me some color film, get me some color film." And Jim Lovell is kind of trying to tell him what to do, and he's saying, "Just get me the film, just get me the film." It's really such an amazing moment because they go from looking at the moon to suddenly this amazing Earthrise, and then the next day, Christmas Eve, they did an Earthrise reading from Genesis 1. And honestly, it took me many years to absorb that, but it lifted my spirits. And I think that happened for a lot of people. It became an icon for the environmental movement. In many ways, it kickstarted the environmental movement. It's still one of the most famous photographs of all time. And it is the overview effect. And some people mistakenly think that there was no overview effect until there was Earthrise. However, in my book, I include any flight where you get to see the whole Earth or you get to see the Earth in context qualifies for the overview effect. So it had been happening for about from 61 to 68. People had been having an overview effect experience, but there was no name for it. And actually, there was really no name for it until 1985, 86, when I wrote my book. And that having a name changes everything. And it's fascinating that for 25 years, people were having this experience, but it didn't get much attention because it didn't have a handle, if you will.
And you have a funny story about how that name came to you.
Yeah, and again, sometimes people confuse Earthrise, 1968, with the origin story of the overview effect, which was an epiphany that I had on an airplane. And so I had been, ever since 68, I had been searching for a way into the whole space community. I knew there were people out there who were not involved in the engineering side, but were involved in the human side. And I just had to find them. And I found Gerard K. O'Neill, who doesn't get enough credit for his transformational work, because in the early 70s, he created the Space Studies Institute. And what he was interested in was what I now call large-scale space migration. That is, he had an idea that people could live very well off the Earth, and that it would benefit the Earth to move industry and people out into the solar ecosystem. And so he welcomed poets, he welcomed astronauts, he welcomed social scientists and philosophers to the Space Studies Institute, because we were thinking about living out there, not just going there and coming back. So I was thinking about that concept almost 24/7. And I was flying cross country to do a consulting effort. And I was looking out the window and thinking about all of this, about what it would be like to live in outer space. And it just hit me. I would have an overview of the Earth. That was the term. I would experience the overview effect. And I realized, well, that's just science fiction because there's nobody living out there. How can you prove it? I knew I had a hypothesis, but I didn't have any data. And my solution was to interview astronauts because they were proxies for these future people. And So I talked to NASA, and they agreed to have me interview 2 active astronauts if I came to Houston. And the public affairs guy really opened the door to the whole thing. He said, "You ought to interview retired astronauts." I'd never thought of that, interestingly. And he said, "You don't have to get our permission. They're free to do what they want." So I was able to network my way to a total of 16 interviews, and then to publish the book in 1987. And now we're up to, I think the 4th edition has about 40 interviews, but I have done more than that. I have something like 50 interviews. And that's the data. And I keep doing the interviews because I learned something new from everybody who's had that experience.
So, and this experience is going to get more and more widespread, right? There's something called citizen astronauts
Mm-hmm.
that is on the horizon that I mentioned in your introduction.
Yeah.
Share a little bit about that with us.
Yeah. So there are 2 aspects to that term. And you could talk about citizen astronauts or commercial astronauts being those folks who are flying on, let's say, Blue Origin or on Virgin Galactic, or there's another program that Axiom is doing, which is a private company using SpaceX to take people to the International Space Station. And on and on. I could go on. There are quite a few different ways to go. And there are also new companies that are using stratospheric balloons to take people high into the stratosphere. The point of it is they are not NASA astronauts. They are not from Roscosmos in Russia. They're not taikonauts, which is what people call Chinese astronauts. They're people like you and me. And this is profound, that we're now in a situation where you don't have to be superhuman to be an astronaut. I have really close friends who now can legitimately say, "I'm an astronaut." I mean, Linda, you and I could do it. It's really a matter of money. And, you can say, well, that's a barrier, and it is, but it's not like Nicole Stott, who's remarkable in so many ways. And actually, the NASA astronauts I've interviewed are just totally amazing people. But a citizen astronaut is a different kind of person, and I've met many of them, and actually they're pretty amazing as well.
Nicole Stott, who did she have so many nice things to say about? One of the characters in the world that people either love or hate. Jeff Bezos?
It's probably Jeff. Yeah, I mean,
yes.
Jeff Bezos is an interesting person because people don't like him for many reasons, which I won't get into. But he has wanted to have his own space company for years. Yeah. And that's really driven him in everything he's done in business. And, it's very interesting because he went on the first flight of Blue Origin. Mm-hmm. And he came back and said, he said, "I've experienced the overview effect." And then he started giving money to environmental causes. And he said, "I'm going to be more involved in the environment." And because people don't like him, they tend to dismiss it. But one of the things that's very promising about the commercial astronaut industry is NASA astronauts are civil servants. They don't have a lot of money. So a person like Jeff Bezos or some of the other billionaires who are flying, they have the money to come back and make a difference in the environment, in war and peace. Some of them are going to be celebrities William Shatner was deeply, deeply moved by his experience, and he is talking about it. And so, this is something very, very important. And the other thing, citizen astronaut is also a term that Space for Humanity uses. For Humanity, I'm on the advisory council there. They are basically, you compete again, you do have to compete, but it's really, they're looking for diverse people who probably wouldn't get to go otherwise. And so the people who are flying with Space for Humanity, they get the experience for free, and then they come back and they're citizen astronauts, and part of the deal is you have to come back and do something good for the Earth. And usually I think it's couched in terms of, there are 17 sustainable development goals that the UN has that are, if the sustainable development goals were realized, the world would be a better place. And in fact, I'm part of a group. Our effort is to create an 18th SDG, which it'd be called Space for All. So we want everyone to have access. And if you think about it, it's a tool of social change. Okay, I'm going to give you this trip, which is going to be amazing, but it's not a joyride for you, Linda. You make a deal with me to come back and do something for your community. I love it. I think it's great. I'm proud to be part of Space for Humanity. And a couple of the people that they've flown are Sarah Sabri, who's the first Egyptian to fly, and Katia Echezarreta, who's the first Mexican-born woman to fly. And they also participated in a flight for Ed Dwight, who was going to be the first African-American astronaut, but he never got to fly. It was largely, I think, because President Kennedy was assassinated, and I believe President Kennedy had championed having Ed Dwight fly. But he came back, and it was beautiful. He said to one of the interviewers, he said, I convinced myself I did not need this. In other words, I didn't get to go into outer space. I convinced myself I didn't really need it. I became an artist, but I was lying to myself. I really needed it. And, I am making the point that I believe the overview effect is a human right. It's the truth, right? It tells the truth. Ron Guerin is another astronaut I've worked with, and he says, we are just living a lie. We don't see reality on this planet. So if it's that great, if I may use that term, everybody should get to experience it. Now, I'm not advocating everyone go on a commercial flight, although that'd be lovely, but we have virtual reality experiences that are pretty powerful, and it would change the world. It would change the world if even a very large percentage of human beings could have this experience.
Okay, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue with Frank White, because I've got some very important questions on that. I think space needs a new PR agent, but we'll talk about that when we come back.
Yeah, I agree.
You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time or maybe even the emotional stamina to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So, if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back with Frank White. What do you call yourself? Are you the founder, the author, the creator of the Overview Effect, the discoverer, the namer?
No, that's a very interesting question that I've struggled with, because I think the safest thing to say is the person who coined the term, the overview effect, and
Okay.
who has developed the theory of the overview effect.
Yes, there you go.
Because,
There you go.
yeah,
Yeah, I was completely taken by learning of this. I have a good imagination. I'll always have. And I could see the same thing that you see, the same potential that you see in this. What if, and why aren't we using, virtual reality and every other bit of a technology to make sure, Rank, how would the life change of a 5-year-old
yeah,
if they knew about the overview effect and they had that
yeah,
context for everything that happened thereafter? Think about
I
that.
know.
Tell us,
That's
tell us what you think about that. Like,
well,
what?
interestingly enough. Well, first of all, there is a movement to quote unquote bring the overview effect down to earth. What is that? It's a group of people. Uh, some of them are involved in my nonprofit, the Human Space Program. There are other nonprofits, many other nonprofits, tackling different parts of this issue. And there is a Space Education Alliance that's aimed at the educational aspect, including young people. And the people who are involved have the same attitude you do, which is young people have not become cynical. They are often very curious. They're excited about the whole enterprise. I have a grandson who fits into that category, and I have a cousin who fits in that category. These are young people. They're excited about the whole thing. And it's the right place, the right age to, again, have them see the wonders of humanity's path and journey. And, I've co authored a book called Star Sailor, which is for young people, with Anahita Nazami, who is a psychologist in London. And we're very involved in promoting these ideas to young people. We're working with another author, Brett Hofstadt, and he has written a book called Goodnight Moonbase, again aimed at young people. And I really think that's an incredibly important audience.
People see me looking down and writing here. I already have a long list of things that people can find in the show notes that Frank and I have mentioned. We're going to put this NASA clip that you talked about, NASA Down to Earth. It's it on YouTube. You
Yes.
gave me that. Yeah, we're going to find that there. People can find this picture of the Earthrise if they haven't seen it, and just
Mm-hmm.
absorb it. I'm going to make sure we turn people on to Jared O'Neill. Is it
Gerard,
Gerard K? Yeah,
yes.
Gerard K. O'Neill. And then I'm going to send people to the interviews, 2 of them that I've done with Nicole Stott. Also, this organization, Space for Humanity, for sure. People can find links
Definitely.
to that, and your human space program.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll make sure that they get there.
Yeah.
How about Buckminster Fuller? You know,
Yeah.
whoa, I have a young mind that I interviewed at the beginning of this whole podcast journey, who was 17 and already had 3 TED Talks. Extraordinary
Mhm.
young mind. What a story of resilience he had to be the person he was. But anyway, he has a newsletter, and he's a senior at the University of Illinois right now. And just the other day, he was quoting Buckminster Fuller, and I
Yeah.
thought, the
Yeah.
the next generation has found Buckminster. And then Goodnight. What was the name of the children's book? Goodnight
One of
Moonbase.
them is Star Sailor,
Okay.
and the other is Goodnight Moonbase.
Okay.
Star Sailor is more for like 8 or 9 year olds, and
Mm-hmm.
Goodnight Moonbase is for
Great.
younger children.
Okay, so I'm keeping a list here and
Good.
so if you find this podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, you're not going to have access to all this really cool information. And the Goodness Exchange, the big website there, is free. So if you find this interview and the article that will go with it over there at the Goodness Exchange, you're going to have access to instant links to all this great stuff. Thank you,
Great.
Frank, for sharing so diligently. Okay, so talk to us about this. You told me this great story during our pre-interview about the insightful reporter who asked the space station astronauts about the current conflict in Israel.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a terrible time. The Hamas attack on Israel had just occurred, and people were reeling from that. And, you didn't have to be an Israeli, or you didn't have to be a Jewish person to be astonished at what happened. But then it was followed by the Israeli attack on Gaza, and it was kind of a double blow of just the saddest aspects of our existence on this planet. Again, what the astronauts said, and I can't remember who it was, but the reporter said, "What do you guys think?" You look down, and you pass over this conflict 16 times a day. And the astronaut I could have written what he said. He said, "We don't see borders and boundaries. We just don't see what's happening down there, and it's really hard for us to understand what's happening." Now, I'm paraphrasing, but the point is that was a great moment because it was a moment of reality where the astronauts were just speaking the truth, as I said before. I don't know if they were supposed to comment, to be honest with you, but they used what I would call overview talk, overview language, and they really answered honestly, which is, we don't see what you see.
Have you ever heard that analogy? I was interviewing a wonderful man. He's a lead person in Harvard's Institute for Human Flourishing.
Yeah.
Matthew Lee, boy, he's something. I'll put a link to that interview
Yeah.
too. And he told me this great little analogy about the fact that, okay, you can pick anything in the room. Anybody who's sitting and listening to this can pick something and make a little square with putting your fingers together and look at that thing, that one thing, through that little square and describe it. And you're
Mm-hmm.
going to describe it, and you're right.
Yeah.
But then if you go out, 150 feet up in the air and look at the exact same thing and describe it, you're
It's
also right.
yeah. And that's really very important. It's all perspective, and that's another aspect of the overview effect. As I mentioned earlier, the diversity and what we might call the chaos of our world is real, and there's no point in denying it just because you've seen it in a different way. And yet the overview perspective is just as real. And we do have a choice every day, whether we've gone to outer space or not, to choose the perspective. that we wish to have. And that's why I love what you're doing, because you have chosen to look at the wonderful things that 8 billion people are doing. Or I don't know how many people are in the good conspiracy, but really, again, our news media primarily focuses on the anomalous people, in my mind, the people who are not doing good things. And that's what works for them. But it does really ignore a perspective, which is, wow, humanity's doing amazing stuff.
Yes. Well, you mentioned to me in the pre-call about the astronauts on the ISS.
Yeah.
Know they have to rely on each other. And there's Russians and Americans who
Yeah.
can't afford to nurture difference.
Yeah. And
Their lives depend on each other.
yeah. And I think it's Nicole who's pointed out that micro society is an example of how we should be living here. The ISS is a spacecraft, really, and the Earth is a spacecraft. And the astronauts know that they are all in it together. The differences are not relevant. Let's put it that way. They're just not. Whereas here on Spaceship Earth, which is a term Bucky Fuller made famous, on Spaceship Earth, we don't see it that way. We don't see that we're all in this together. We don't see that we're actually damaging the spacecraft by our behavior. But that's what we're trying to change. That's what we're changing is we. I think we'll have a new generation who'll just know that from the start.
Me too. I've done some interviews with young people, and I've interviewed people who are working with this Gen Z.
Yeah.
At the University of Maryland, they have an incredible the Do Good Institute, which is now
Mm.
just a foundational thing at the University of Maryland. But I'll put that interview in the show notes too. But I think what that generation is recognizing is another thing that I'd love for you to comment on that you commented on in our pre-call. You said it's our leaders who have these nationalist priorities. But if you look at the 8 billion people on the earth, most of us could get along.
Yeah, we could. It's interesting to me. Jake Garn, senator from Utah, was able, because of his position in the Senate, to get a flight on the shuttle back in the 80s. Yeah, and I interviewed him in his office in Washington, D.C., and that interview is in the book. And that's exactly what he said. The people are not in conflict. It's the leaders, it's the nationalistic perspective that is the problem. And I've had friends of mine say this. One of the members of our group, Mike Simmons, is an astronomer, and he has spent a lot of time in Iran. And he says, the Iranians don't hate America. The government hates America, but the people don't. And I had that experience in the 60s even. I was traveling around Europe doing a documentary for WGBH radio in Boston. And I fell in with a group of friends, young people in Prague. And at the time, they were under the control of the Soviet Union. And they didn't hate America, but they hated the Soviet Union. They really did. And they said to me at one point, Frank, we're supposed to report to the authorities that you're here. Might be a spy or something. And they said, but we're not going to do it. And I loved it. I just thought it was great. And I was staying in a hotel, and this woman who was the manager, I think, came up to me and very furtively said, I have this. And it was a gold coin with President Kennedy's face. Or, it was President Kennedy, because I was there in 67. And she loved John Kennedy. I mean, you could repeat that again and again and again. I mean, astronauts have talked about it too, and how when they get together, they don't talk politics, they talk about their children. We're all human. That's the whole point.
That's the whole point. That's the whole point. I want to turn people on to an interview I did with an amazing 26-year-old, 27-year-old YouTuber who has hundreds of thousands of fans. He leads trips to Iraq. It's his favorite country in the world. He's lived and traveled all over the world at 27. He says Iraq is one of the most incredibly undiscovered places for history
Oh, yeah.
and food and people, and they love Americans. And he says this thing which I think gets to the heart of the overview effect as well. He says that people in that country are able to separate our government from us as fellow humans,
Right.
travelers. They totally are. They don't just think, oh, we are scared of the Americans, like we say, oh, we're scared of Iraq. They just totally separate government from people.
I know. And that's a more global view, which is we're all in this together as human beings flying through a very hostile universe. And we really do need to depend on one another. And it's one of those perspectives that might seem idealistic or unrealistic. However, this is an important aspect of studying human history. And I mean big history going back thousands and millions of years. We have been evolving as a species for a very, very long time. And our consciousness has changed. I mean, what people believed 100 years ago even now seems out of date, or even, gosh, 25 years ago. We do change our attitude based on new information. And I'm very, very hopeful that we can bring the overview effect down to earth, and that will be part of a new stage of human evolution.
Yeah, and let's talk about that evolution thing. Like that's what we've been already doing. If you look at 200,000 years of human history in this form, because that's about how
Yes.
far they date us back. We we aren't anywhere near who we were in thought or deed or our
No.
abilities 200,000 years ago. So there's no reason to think we're at the end of some line right now. Talk about, Carl Sagan used to say, we are the way the universe knows itself.
Yeah. That's really a key aspect of my third book. The overview effect is really a trilogy now. It's the overview effect, space exploration, and human evolution, and then the new Camelot, and then the Cosma hypothesis. And I ask myself, why do we always talk about space exploration in terms of how it can benefit humanity? What can we get out of it? What about the universe? What about the larger environment? Over millions of years, evolution has created us. We are able to create spaceships and satellites and other space related technologies to really see everything in a new way. What's the purpose of that? Why does the universe support that? And it's just a hypothesis. I'm not sure I'm right, but I think we're here to spread life, intelligence, and self awareness through the universe. I think I call the universe Cosmo. That's my name for the universe. I think Cosmo becomes more intelligent and more self aware through species like us. And what we don't know yet is, are there other species like us at our level?
Or
Also,
beyond.
yeah, or beyond
Yeah.
our level.
Yeah,
And
I interviewed Jill Tarter, the
yeah, yeah,
the
I know her.
amazing gal
Yes.
from the SETI Institute. For people who don't know, SETI is our world's most important scientific exploration of the universe for signs of life at our level or beyond. They're not looking for just life that might be a molecule or a one
Right.
cell. They are looking for a life at our level beyond. And she said something I wouldn't mind you commenting on as well. She said, related to what you just said, she said, one of the things that interests her is in finding somebody more advanced than us because it means they got through the bottleneck that we're at right now.
Yeah.
They could kill themselves, but they didn't.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting comment because Elon Musk is a leader of the whole space movement, like him or hate him. And many people like him and many people find him weird. But Elon Musk is a really big thinker, and he talks about the great filter. And it's exactly what Jill's talking about. There's this idea that one of the reasons we haven't heard from other intelligences is that most of them don't make it through the great filter. And what the great filter is, it could be climate change, it could be artificial intelligence turns on its makers, it could be any number of things. We don't know what it is, but we are at that point where we can evolve or go extinct. And yeah, she's exactly right. If we meet another intelligence that's at our level or beyond, that means we can make it.
Yes. I love that. I love that. Okay. So we didn't get to, I was just scrolling up and down on all the questions that we didn't get to today. Frank, would you come back and have another interview?
Oh, anytime. I'm just getting started.
Oh, me too. Me too. We didn't even scratch the surface of my list. Okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to chat soon again. And what I want to wrap up today with is, if this interview had just been 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes I'm sure you look at the big picture and the context of things and what's happening. What do you really wish people knew? If this had been just a short little interview, what do you really wish people knew, Frank?
2 things. One, we have a choice, as we discussed earlier, as a species. Do we want to get through the great filter? Do we want to expand out into the cosmos with all its wonders? Or do we want to stay here and keep fighting among ourselves? It's a choice. 2, maybe you yourself do not have a high position in government or business or other aspects of society. But if you have a choice, do you want your life to be part of the positive evolution of humanity or not? And believe me, I had no right to write the overview effect. I wasn't commissioned to do it. I wasn't an astronaut. I didn't have a PhD. I didn't have any credentials. I just had an experience and it became my life mission. So everybody out there can help make this happen. And everybody here is a crew member of Spaceship Earth.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing, Linda.
All right. Again, I've got an entire page here of things to turn folks on to. I think it's important in times like this for people to know what to do next. Like you get some really wonderful new message, some mind-blowing new landscape like we've added to people's lives here, and then what? So go to the Goodness Exchange, look at this episode with Frank White, and you will find all links to every single thing we talked about. Thank you for joining us for another podcast episode talking about what's right with the world. Frank White, you have certainly been leading that charge. You're a founding member of the conspiracy of goodness of our times.
Proud to be part of it.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.